Hi everyone, good evening. Welcome to Darien Library. My name is Erin Shea and I'm the head of adult programming here at the library. And I just would like to briefly mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. So thank you so much for your continued support to make lectures like these possible. Tonight's guest is the Louis B. and Dorothy Cullman Fellow in the Education Department at the Yale University Art Gallery, and a lecturer in the Education Department at the Museum of Modern Art. She received her PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center in 2010 with a specialization in 20th century art, photography, and film studies. She's here tonight to discuss highlights from the Museum of Modern Art's collection. She's going to walk us through them. It's going to be kind of as if we're at the museum, except the works of art will be on the screen. And then in late November, we are going to have a curator for the current exhibit at the MoMA, which is Renee Magritte. And the curator is going to be here Tuesday, November 26th at 7 p.m. I'll be sending out an email announcement, and that's going to be a really special night as well. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy. Oh, sorry, and her name is Molleen Theodore. I didn't even say her name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a total pleasure to be here. As Erin mentioned, I work at Yale and I work at MoMA, so this is kind of the perfect combination to be talking at this amazing library in Connecticut. And I can say that the event in November with the curator will be wonderful. I've heard her speak and she's really great. So I wanted to just walk through some of the highlights of the MoMA collection. These are the sorts of works that I would talk about if we were actually in the museum. So when you go there, you can kind of hear my voice in your head. And there we go. So I wanted to talk first, for a second, about the history of MoMA and how it began. And it has a history I like to tell, which is that in 1929, 3 women decided that they wanted to show modern art in New York. This was a radical idea at the time. The 3 women were Lily Bliss, Abby Rockefeller, and Mary Quinn. They were referred to as the ladies. And these 3 ladies decided they were really committed to their project. And Lily Bliss had a collection of art. They borrowed art from other people. They rented a space in the Heckscher building, which is pictured on the upper right behind the plaza, which is the building that now holds Bergdorf Goodman, which you might be familiar with. At one time, it held the Museum of Modern Art, and they began in 1929. They opened, I think it was 9 days after the stock market crashed, and still they went ahead with it. Their first exhibition, and I have an image of it on the upper left, included work by European modernists, Gauguin, Cézanne, Seurat, and Van Gogh. And even though this was a radical idea, and one that Abby Rockefeller's husband would not support financially at first, he thought it was such a doomed idea, he came around later and he actually bought the plot of land that MoMA now sits on. It was really popular. A lot of people attended this first show of the European modernists. The next show they had was of, I think it was called 19 living American artists. That was less popular, but it really established MoMA as this institution that was going to show contemporary and modern art. They made some other very radical decisions. They hired a director by the name of Alfred Barr, who I have pictured here on the bottom on the right. He was an adjunct professor at Wesleyan at the time and teaching art history, and they brought him in, and he ended up being an absolute visionary and staying at the museum for very many years. The first retrospective they had was of Henri Matisse. That choice made a lot of sense. He was a well-established, well-respected artist. The second retrospective they had was Diego Rivera. That's a totally radical idea. He was a mid-career artist, Mexican-American artist, and one who worked on fresco, so basically on walls. I don't know how many of you visited the Diego Rivera show at MoMA for a few years ago, but you saw these massive walls that had to be made in order for that exhibition to happen. So here we have some of the different buildings that MoMA has been housed in. On the left was a townhouse. In the middle is the international style building that was built in the 1950s, and on the bottom is the entrance that we have today. MoMA has gone through a number of iterations in terms of its design and space. On the right, you see an image of the most recent redesign, which was by Yoshio Taniguchi, finished in 2004. Has everyone here been to MoMA? Yes? Okay. No. Okay, that's perfect. What you see on the right is we're looking into the atrium, and actually through the glass is the garden, which you see in the image on the left. That garden was restored to its original size and design in the 2004 redesign by Taniguchi, and that's the design that was of the sculpture garden that was made for Abby Rockefeller, designed by Philip Johnson, and it is now restored to its original size and glory. And I recommend that you go there first when you go to MoMA. It's an absolutely lovely place to sit. On the right, we see the atrium, and one of the things that Taniguchi was interested in his redesign was to have kind of playful spaces where you would see people and art as you moved around. So you can see people walking across these bridges, right, in the middle of the screen. When people are walking across the bridge, or when you're walking across the bridge, you can scan across the museum and see people in these kind of framed windows. And in a way, there's this playfulness between what's on display and what's not on display. I want you to notice this work that's on the right, the very, very large sculpture. The atrium, as you'll notice when you go there or when you have been there, is a difficult space to curate. It has really, really high ceilings. It's very open. It's echoey. And the work that's in there is always changing. I think MoMA has a number of times put performances in there. So it's a very dynamic space. It's a challenging space, and it's a dynamic space. So it's one to always check out when you are there. So I thought I would begin talking about this sculpture by Auguste Rodin, Monument to Balzac. He worked on it for a number of years, from 1891 to 1898. And it sits in the museum, often in just off the lobby area and looking out onto the garden. This is a very tall figure, and it has this, I wanted to bring the image on the left, so you see how this figure is towering, kind of turned back, leaning back a bit, almost not stable. Rodin was, and I want to say another reason why I wanted to bring this work is because MoMA's collection begins around 1885 and it goes to the present. So this is an example of something that is representative of the very beginnings of their collection. And something I should have said a moment ago when we were looking at the images of the three ladies is their original idea for the museum was to be modern. And in order to be modern, you needed to have the work that was most current. And they actually set up this idea, this plan, that they would always adjust the years of work that would be in the MoMA's collection. So say it would always be the last 60 years or the last 50 years. And whatever was older than that would go to the Met. They realized pretty quickly that wasn't going to work out well for them, so they changed that plan, and it begins in 1885. There were a few works that came in through gifts that did go to the Met and stayed at the Met. So, for example, there were some Daumiers that are at the Met. I believe there were some Manets that were at the Met. But MoMA's collection begins around 1885, because one of the questions people always ask me is, when does modern art start? And as a representative of MoMA, I want to say, you know, it begins with MoMA's collection, but it actually probably starts to begin a little bit before then. And that's something we can talk about in questions if you're interested. So this is a work by Auguste Rodin. He was born in Paris. That was the center of the art world, the Western art world, when he began making work. He was born in Paris to a not very wealthy family. He struggled in school. He had trouble with reading, with writing, and with arithmetic, and he was nearsighted. But he always was interested in playing with dough. His mother was a big baker, and he would take the dough and kind of move it into shapes. So he had this interest in sculptural forms from a very early time in his life, and he was really persistent about going to art school, to sculpture school. And he applied to this school, the Grande École, 3 times, and 3 times was rejected, which gives us a sense that at this time, and even today, often what people are making at that moment, when someone's making something really radical and avant-garde, it's hard to accept. And that was the case with Rodin. No one really knew how to understand what he was doing. So he worked as many sculptors often do, which is as an apprentice for someone else. Kind of like the manager system, but maybe a little bit more cruel. Someone tells you what to do, you do it, and then they sign their name to it. And that's how the sculpture would be made in many instances. He worked as an apprentice for many years before he kind of hit success on his own. And if you've ever been to Paris, you've probably been to the Rodin Garden, and you've seen how he really did establish his own studio, where he then employed an army of apprentices who he would tell what to make, and he would sign his name to it. So I think he kind of got even in the end. So sculpture was long seen as, in this period I should say, was seen as a kind of second cousin to painting. Painting could be more radical, it was easier to make, it took up less space. In fact, let me just go back for a moment. The artist who made this work on the right, this very large sculpture, who also made painting, said in the 1950s, sculpture is what you bump into as you back up to see a painting. So really, sculpture is this kind of afterthought. And the reason for that is because it's expensive. It takes a lot of training to be able to make sculpture. And also because sculpture often happens by commission. So someone is paying you and paying the sculptor and telling the sculptor what they want, basically, which kind of limits the creative potential. This was no exception. Rodin was commissioned by the Society of Men of Letters in Paris to make a monument to Balzac, Honoré de Balzac, the controversial but celebrated French author. And he worked on it for many years, making little models, making sketches. He got Balzac's measurements and had clothes made in Balzac's size. He worked for a long time on this, and when he was finally finished, and the finished product for Rodin in this instance was a plaster cast. He made this, or a clay model, I should say. He made a clay model. He presented it to the Society of Men of Letters, and they hated it. They said it looked like a sack of coal. It looked like a phallic symbol. They felt that it did not in any way celebrate the author, Balzac. So then what was Rodin doing? He was, I think, trying to capture the essence of Balzac. He was a deep, brooding writer. He used to wake up in the middle of the day and drink pot after pot of coffee, fueling these writing sprees, wearing a dark writing cloak wrapped around him. And I think you get a sense of that in this work, in the way his head is tilted back. He has these massive eyebrows. It's hard to see in the reproduction, but when you go there, you'll see. Rodin was a master at getting these deeply pocketed crevices. So he would work with his hands and really get wonderful texture so that you read this material, which is all bronze, as different materials. You read it as cloth, or the leather of his shoe, or his hair, or his skin. So we can see the way he treats the material gives us information in how to read this form. Rodin was so mad about the way the Society of Men of Letters responded to this work that he refused to have it cast in bronze, and it wasn't cast until 1954, after his death, which I think is really interesting because that means he never saw this work that we see, right? So when you're looking at Rodin's Balzac, if you look up from out these windows, on the right, the garden windows, and you look up, you see this water tower. And it's the kind of thing you may not even notice. If you spend a lot of time in New York, you know that there are these wooden water towers on the top of buildings that are usually 6 stories or higher, and they pump water up to the upper floors. Rachel White-Reed makes casts of objects. And she made a cast of a water tower that was in Soho on Grand Street. And the reason why I am kind of veering away from chronology here is because I think it's interesting that 100 years separates these two works. And you see kind of where sculpture goes during this period, from a monument that's meant to celebrate a writer to this kind of literal reproduction of this object, a functional object. She made a cast of this water tower in resin. It's about 4 inches thick, otherwise hollow. And it's this pretty amazing work that I hope you'll look for when you're at MoMA, because seeing it in real life is quite different than seeing it in reproduction. She was commissioned, again, sculpture often happens by commission, by the Public Art Fund in New York to make a work of art. She's a British sculptor. She spent some time in New York, and in the end she said, actually, I can't make anything. I'm not a New Yorker. New York is too full anyway. And they really insisted and begged her to make something. And so she started thinking about making a cast of a park bench or a water tower. These objects that you see all over the place in New York that you never really think too much about. So she made a cast of this water tower. And what I think is really great, or what I always like about it, is 2 things. One, you may not notice it, but once you do notice it, you start to notice water towers everywhere. You notice Rachel Whiteread's water tower, and you notice the actual functional water towers. And they're very sculptural. It kind of turns you on, turns your perception on in a way to see art all around you. It also takes on its ambient surroundings in a way that's quite different than, say, the Rodin. It glows in the moonlight, which is, I think, what's happening on the right. If the sun hits it, it's almost blinding. On a cloudy day, it kind of blends in with the background. So it really changes depending on what's happening that day. And I think that that's another exciting development in sculpture. So those 2 works you see if you're on the entry-level floor of MoMA. And what most people do when they go to MoMA is they go right up to the 5th floor. That's where many of the highlights, the kind of heavy hitters of the collection reside. As you probably know, MoMA has painting and sculpture, but we also have design, objects of design. We have architecture. We have photography. MoMA was established one of the earliest photography departments at any museum. So this is a work by Paul Cézanne, Still Life with Apples, from 1895 to 1898. And Cézanne was born in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. He was trained as a lawyer. He was a very good lawyer, but he always was interested in drawing. He took illustration classes as a young child, and he was quite good at it. And at a certain point in the beginnings of a successful law career, he decided he was going to go to Paris. Paris was the center of the Western art world at that time, and he wanted to make it as an artist. And his father pretty much disowned him over it, thought it was a very bad idea. And at first, it seemed like a bad idea. Cézanne exhibited some works in some exhibitions, and the public and the critics did not appreciate the work that he was making. There was a fairly strict structure in the Parisian exhibition world at that time. There were these salons that you needed to get into in order to exhibit your work. That was one of the best places for your work to be seen. And within those viewing structures, there was a kind of hierarchy of genres in which you could paint, and there were rules associated with those genres. So if you painted in history painting or landscape painting, there were certain rules you needed to follow. If you painted in portraiture, rules to follow. Still life was considered the lowest of all the genres, and it was a good place to experiment because nobody really cared about it. So when Cézanne first came to Paris, he exhibited a variety of work. When it didn't get a very good reception, he kind of retreated from the exhibition world. And the next time he exhibited still lifes, and only still lifes. And still, he got some complaints. One critic said his still lives were detestable jokes. Another critic said that his still lives weren't still enough. Which is a funny thing to say, but I think it has some meaning in what the critic is getting at. There was really, since the Renaissance, this idea in painting that when you make a painting, it should look like a window onto the world. It should look like a scene that you would believe you're seeing out a window. So the artist should capture or be able to portray a kind of three-dimensional illusionism. So you don't think you're looking at the flat plane of a canvas, but rather you're looking through a space. Cézanne knew perfectly well how to do that, but he wanted to do something else. Artists had mastered realism. There was photography that could give you a very clear documentation of a scene. Cézanne wanted to invent something new. And that's what I think he's doing here. And that's what the critic and the public was really uncomfortable with. I should say that artists always loved Cézanne. Matisse had a still life by Cézanne that he hung in his studio, and other artists like Picasso would go to see it just to see how Cézanne had treated a space. So to go back to that critic's comment, it wasn't still enough. You see here that this is a table in a room, right? And the table is kind of shoved into this corner. The table should be parallel to the ground, but the way that Cézanne depicts it, it's actually pointed downward, giving you the sense that the fruit that's on the table, and the fruit actually looks like it has volume and mass. He paints that in a way that is, properly illusionistic, we could say. But the table doesn't seem parallel to the ground. And the fruit looks as if it might come rolling toward us. I think that that's true here. It's even more acute when you're seeing it in real life. And that, I think, is what the critic was really upset about with this scene, that Cézanne didn't make it seem as if this were a still life, as if no movement was happening here. So this tension that we see in Cézanne's work between the mass and volume of the fruit and then the flatness or the lack of the way in which he realizes the table. This tension, I would say, is a tension between a two-dimensional, a reminder that you're looking at a two-dimensional plane, and an illusion that this is a three-dimension, or that we're looking out onto three dimensions. So this tension between 2D and 3D is really the tension, and we see it here very well with Cézanne, between realism and abstraction. And he's moving toward realism and moving away from realism and toward abstraction. And that, in a way, is how we could define the modern. And that's certainly something that Alfred Barr, the director, and many others at MoMA were very interested in. Artists, too. Artists will take this move toward abstraction even farther. I should say that it was a year after Cézanne's death that there was a posthumous exhibition of his work when the critics and the public actually started to be very excited about his work. So he had this kind of belated reception. Speaking of belated receptions, Van Gogh certainly had one, and from artists too. Cézanne said something like, "You positively paint like a madman," when he saw the work of Van Gogh. And that is also a reminder that Van Gogh really suffered mentally, and very often his reputation and his mental illness preceded people's appreciation of his work. So this work you should absolutely go see when you're at MoMA. This is part of the reason why people run up to the 5th floor, and this is just an example of what you'll see there. Everybody taking a picture of it with your iPhone. I recommend looking at it for a long time with your eyes first, because there's so many things that you'll notice when you're seeing it in real life. The texture, for one. There is such heavy painting in certain passages of this painting where the artist actually put paint down with a palette knife rather than a brush. I mean, it's just loaded on. And then you can see along the edges that there's bare canvas revealed. So you see the weave of the canvas. Van Gogh was from the Netherlands. He was largely self-taught as an artist. He came to Paris in the 1880s, and he brought with him the painting he was most proud of. And he realized he was a good painter, but he wasn't painting like anybody else. And in Paris at that time, there really was a kind of trajectory that artists were moving on, and Van Gogh's just not on that trajectory. He was using color and distortion to express emotion, and there just wasn't really a place for him at that moment, and he felt that. He also was having these excruciating headaches. He decided to leave Paris and go to Arles in the south of France, where he continued to have headaches and also seizures. We don't know if it was epilepsy or schizophrenia, but he was really, really suffering. In between these episodes, he was churning out what we now recognize as one masterpiece after another. He sold one, maybe two paintings during his lifetime, which is a sad and tragic end to what is now recognized as an absolutely brilliant career. He spent less than a year in Arles, and then he checked himself into an insane asylum in Saint-Remy, which is not too far from Arles. And there he lived in a monastery. He had two cells. One was his studio and one was his apartment. And this is the view out his studio window. What we're looking at is the town of Saint-Remy. You can see the steeple. That steeple, I think, has some northern nostalgia to it. Maybe he's thinking of the Netherlands. You don't usually see steeples like that in the south of France. But notice the way this painting is divided. We have about 3/4 of the painting is the sky, this upper celestial realm, and then the bottom quarter is the man-made earthly realm. He's obviously more interested in this upper realm, right? The way the city is depicted is with these angles and geometry. It's very, very orderly. And then there's this crazy energy to the sky, to the mountains that almost look like waves, to this cypress tree that almost looks like a flame bridging these two regions. He made many paintings. He also wrote his brother Theo many, many letters. And while he was in Saint-Remy in the asylum, he wrote letters asking for specific colors of paint. So there's paintings he wants to make in this time. But he also says things like, "I'm too utterly shattered for life outside," which I take to mean he can live in the asylum, but he can't live in that man-made city or one like it. And within a year, he will leave the asylum and die of what was long thought to be self-inflicted gunshot wounds. I have recently heard that it's possible teenagers attacked him. I'm not sure what the story is, but it was a short and tragic life with a number of works that seem to capture our attention endlessly. I'll say one other thing about this painting, which is that we've done X-ray works on this painting, and we found out that actually Van Gogh originally treated the bottom part of this painting with the same energy and curves and texture as he treated the top. And then he went back and changed it and made this very orderly city on the bottom. And I think it would be a very different painting had he kept it the way he had it originally. Oh, I said I was only going to say one more thing. I'm saying one more thing about Van Gogh. So I mentioned those three ladies. Lily P. Bliss was one of the three women who started MoMA. And she had a sizable collection of her own. She died shortly after MoMA began. I think she died in 1932 or 33. And she gave her collection, which was amazing, to MoMA as long as they could raise the funds to care for it, which they did. In this gift, she said that they could sell any work in the gift, except for I think 2 works, if ever they needed to sell a work to buy something new, which is a pretty amazing and generous approach to your legacy. And so this Starry Night, a work that is kind of synonymous with MoMA, was bought with her bequest, and many other works that you will think of you'll think of MoMA when you see them were bought through selling works from her collection. Okay, I'm really done with Van Gogh now. So this is Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from June and July of 1907. This has been called the most important painting of the 20th century. I don't know if I would say that, but I will say it's the most written about painting of the 20th century. So much ink has been shed trying to understand what Picasso was doing here, why he painted these figures the way that he did, why he depicted this scene. So Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is the young ladies of Avignon. Avignon is a street in the red light district of Barcelona, so it is a reference to his hometown. He actually didn't give the name to the painting. His friends did, and he said it was fine. He worked on this painting for 2 months over the summer. You see that there is a woman on the left kind of pulling back a curtain to reveal this scene in a brothel. And you'll notice also the way that he has depicted these figures. Picasso was a fabulous draftsman from, say, the age of 12. He knew perfectly well how to paint the window onto the world, as I was saying before. But here, he decides to do something else and really decides to kind of abandon, reject many of the conventions that he has been taught. There is a tradition in the French classical tradition of depicting the female nude. Here he gives us 5 female nudes, but he depicts them in a way that is completely against everything that people expect. He looks to non-Western art in his realization of these figures. On the left, he's looking at oceanic art. The middle 2 figures, he's looking at Iberian art, so the peninsula of Spain and Portugal, his heritage. And on the right, he's looking at African art. African art was newly visible in Paris at that time. Matisse and a number of other artists who he was associated with had gone to Africa and brought back African sculptures. So there were some African sculptures that artists were passing around. They were very interested in the way that these objects weren't art objects that went in a museum. They were objects that were actually used in ritual and in dance. They were also interested in the way that these objects weren't wedded to reality. They had bulky forms or angular forms. They departed from a strict one-to-one relationship with the figure that was being depicted. And artists were really interested in that. That was a way to kind of get around or move toward abstraction. And that's what Picasso does here. He depicts these figures with great flatness. So when he depicts a thigh, for example, rather than modeling, which he knows perfectly well how to do, he just does a flat thigh. If you notice the transition in the second figure from the left, from her hip to her stomach, that's just 2 different colors. He doesn't bother to blend it. He's giving us this very angular, almost robotic form. He appears to put masks on these figures, and masks are very common in these cultures. Notice the 2 middle figures. Their eyes are looking at us, but their nose is to the side. So it's like you're getting these figures from 2 different perspectives at once. This was very, very jarring to people at the time. And on the figure on the right, who's seated, it's not clear whether she's opening her legs to us or if we're looking at her back, and that was really, really surprising to people. There's an unfinished quality to the work, particularly the masks on the right where there's cross-hatching and decoration. This idea that women in a brothel would be concealing their identity was also shocking. Notice the back looks like broken glass. There's a way in which he is moving toward cubism in this picture. It will be the following summer that he invents cubism, but we're seeing some gestures toward it. Originally, there were 2 male figures in this work, Picasso and a friend of his. In one of them, he's holding a book about venereal disease. He was apparently obsessed with venereal disease, as he probably should have been because he spent a lot of time in brothels. In another one, he's holding a skull, perhaps equating sex and death, sex in a brothel with death, I should say. In the end, he removes the 2 male figures. This is a very large painting. It's about 7 feet tall. It's meant to be hung close to the ground. And the figures are looking at us. And I think in that way, we kind of become the client here. By removing the male figures, he implicates us in this scene. And I think that that's one of the reasons why people were so shocked by it. His friends knew he was working on it. He showed it to a few people, and there was just this like, oh my God, what has he done? And he rolled it up and put it away. And no one saw it for a while until a couple years later it went into a salon and it eventually came into the hands of MoMA. But this is often seen as the kind of anchor of the collection. I'm going to skip this work right now. When you go to MoMA, you'll notice that in the room right next to Van Gogh is the work on the left by Marcel Duchamp, this bicycle wheel. And this is really what it is, a kitchen stool with a bicycle wheel turned upside down on it. This is an artist who is a perfectly good painter, who was exhibiting in salons in Paris, but in 1913 he decided to collect some objects from his studio and from the streets of Paris and call them works of art. So moving away from this idea of, that artist's brushstroke and toward an idea that a work can be an idea. It can be about selection or designation. So Marcel Duchamp saying, this urinal that I think is very sculptural is a work of art. And in fact, that's what he did. And he called it Fountain. And it made people pretty angry. This idea, he calls these ready-mades. They're ready-made by a factory, by someone else. As the artist, he selects them and calls them a work of art. The Fountain annoyed people, particularly for the title, but nobody really paid attention to him until about the 1950s, when he has this belated reception, and artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol get very excited about this idea that a work of art can be an idea, that you can grab things from culture and incorporate it into your own work. I'm going to skip ahead a few. I'll stop here for one moment. These are Claude Monet's water lilies. I recommend that you sit in front of them. This is a very, I feel bad about this presentation of them because they're these massive works. And I needed to put them across because that's the way that they are meant to be displayed as a kind of triptych. There are benches in the room in which they hang. So there is a way in which you go in front of them and you can have this kind of meditative experience. I wanted to mention these works in particular because in talking about the history of MoMA, there was a very big fire at MoMA. I think it was in 1958. I wrote it down. Yeah, 1958. And in that fire, Monet, that everybody loved, was burned, and they lost it. And the museum was devastated. And they sent Alfred Barr, the director, on an acquisition trip. And they said, we need a new Monet, get something small. And this is what he came back with. And he said, I had to get the best one. But I mean, it's this massive work. And I can't do justice talking about them, so I'm just going to say, when you're there, you should go spend some time in front of them. So Alfred Barr was really interested in kind of writing the history of art and writing it with MoMA's collection. He had a number of very important exhibitions in the 1930s. This is Cubism and Abstract Art. And you can see for this exhibition, he made this chart figuring out where all these different modes of art making kind of fit together. And this chart, this understanding of how art history developed was very, very, very influential. I wouldn't say that it's still used necessarily, but for a long time, MoMA was kind of writing the history of art through its collection and through Alfred Barr's ideas. He had this Cubism and Abstract Art show. He had another one on Dada, Surrealist, and Fantastic Art, and a number of other survey exhibitions that presented the collection as a kind of history of art. Okay, so now we're going to jump from Paris, where I said Paris was the center of the art world, the Western art world. That really changes around 1942 with the Second World War, and the center of the art world shifts from Paris to New York. So many artists who would have gone to Paris or would have gone to, would have stayed in Paris, instead go to New York. Jackson Pollock was born in Wyoming. He lived mostly on the West Coast. He had a fairly peripatetic upbringing. But he always knew he wanted to be an artist. And in the 20s, he came to New York, and he studied at the Art Students League. He studied with a figurative painter, so someone who actually paints people and forms. And that was his beginnings as an artist. But as you probably know, if you know a little bit about Jackson Pollock, in the 1940s, he decided to take his canvas, and so canvases are typically, or were typically on an easel. Those works that we looked at by Monet, he had these massive paintings on easels. He would climb up on a ladder into his 80s and make these paintings. Pollock takes the canvas from the easel and puts it down on the ground, on the floor. And he moves around it, enacting a kind of choreography in making his works, so that he's pouring and dripping and splattering paint on this canvas. They're massive, very, very large canvases. There's a sense of process and action in the making of the work. This is the mode of art making that gets really celebrated after the Second World War. There's this sense by artists, and many of the artists who came to New York were from Europe, were escaping Europe. There's this sense that we need a new way to communicate and a new way to depict the world. And these artists turn toward abstraction, and Jackson Pollock is among them. He's the first, I believe he's the first artist, abstract artist, who makes money on his work. So previously, abstraction was accepted to a point, but not really financially, maybe critically successful. He was critically and financially successful. He had a critic by the name of Clement Greenberg who supported him, wrote about him. There was an article in a mainstream magazine with the title, "Is Jackson Pollock the greatest living American painter?" So there was this sense that people really recognized that he was onto something really great. He, as you might know, worked in this mode of these large paintings, and he, at a certain point, decided to start letting figuration into his work. And I will just say that it was MoMA's collection and display of works that in some ways influenced Pollock's turn. He saw this work by Picasso called Guernica on display at MoMA in one of Barr's exhibitions. And Pollock was really interested in this large-scale work that was moving toward abstraction. Toward the end of his career, this is from 1953, Pollock started to let a figuration enter back into his work. And that, too, I think, has some connection to work that he was seeing at MoMA, for example. There was a big Matisse exhibition, and this work on the right, where Matisse really heavily relies on black, I think was probably quite influential in Pollock's thinking. His mode of art making was so successful, and he has a pretty short span of his life because he dies quite young. There was a lot of pressure in New York to continue to paint like Jackson Pollock, and many artists felt a pressure to paint that way. This is a sculpture by David Smith called Australia. So in the abstract expressionist group, we have artists like Jackson Pollock. We also have sculptors like David Smith, and this is a work that you'll see when you go. There was such pressure to paint like Jackson Pollock in this abstract way that artists kind of didn't know what to do. There was pressure to fling, and drip, and pour paint onto a canvas, and to stay resolutely abstract. Jasper Johns is one artist who responds to that kind of edict to paint in an abstract way by using symbols. He kind of he skirts the issue by using symbols and numbers and recognizable shapes. So here we have stars and stripes, so abstract in a way, and yet it's a symbol that we all read to mean something. He made many other works that played with this idea of how we recognize images. I wanted to bring up the work of Andy Warhol as a kind of continuation and digestion of the ready-made that I showed you by Duchamp. Andy Warhol would take images from the press. So, for example, in Gold, Marilyn Monroe, he took a publicity shot of Marilyn Monroe from the film Niagara, and he made a silkscreen of it, and then put it on this gold field. In the Campbell soup cans that we have in the upper right, he takes something from the supermarket shelves. He's taking these ready-made designs and incorporating them into his work. I'm going to move ahead a few. So you'll notice with the Andy Warhol that there was a kind of grid to what he was making, but he was referencing what you see in the everyday world. In the mid-1960s, artists were really interested in this idea of seriality in the grid, in repetition. But they began to reject any kind of reference to the everyday world or the supermarket shelves or the world of movie and television. Donald Judd is one of those artists. He gets very interested in in material, in the perfection of making objects, and in sculpting space. So this is a work that he calls Untitled Stack, so it's very literal, from 1967. And this work he made by making a sketch of it. He starts out as a painter, he starts out by making his own boxes, but he realizes that he wants his work to have a perfection that he can't achieve. So he would make a sketch of a work, call the piece of paper a certificate that has information about how the work should be made, and then a fabricator can actually make the work in the shape and size that he's designated. And this is an example of one of those works. It actually goes up very high on the ceiling. There are these boxes that are galvanized iron and painted on the edge with a green lacquer. Every single one of these boxes is the same. They're 9 inches high, and there's 9 inches between them. And I should say again, I don't want to repeat this too many times, this is the kind of work that you probably, it's hard to capture the scale in a slide, and it looks quite different in real life. Donald Judd is of a generation of artists who wrote a lot about his work. He provided the kind of intellectual framework for his work, and he was a successful critic before he was a successful artist. He also became very interested in the space of the gallery. He wanted to have a lot of space around his work, because you can imagine with a work like this, if you were to put, say, a painting right next to it, it's really going to change the way you experience it. He ended up buying a huge plot of land out in western Texas in a town called Marfa. 340 acres of land, an old army compound, and installing his work and the work of his friends in this place. So there's a move outside of the city that, and there's a thinking that within the confines of the city, there's always this, this pressure to change exhibitions, to have them up for 3 months. And he really wanted works to be permanently installed, and that's what he got in Marfa. In the image on the left, there is this old artillery shed where he replaced the sides with glass, and it gets this gorgeous western light. And what's inside this room are 100 aluminum boxes. And that might sound kind of crazy and monotonous, but it's actually pretty amazing. While we have artists like Donald Judd who like repetition and the same, there's another artist who I wanted to bring up named Eva Hesse. And here we have 2 works of hers, and I should say that if ever you get a chance to see an Eva Hesse work, you should. While Judd was using galvanized iron, objects that will probably be around forever, Eva Hesse used degradable materials. She used resin and fiberglass and wire and gauze. And she made these objects that people often refer to as process art or post-minimalism. So they come after this minimal order that we saw before. So she takes repetition but then kind of messes it up. On the left we see these, what are actually casts of garbage cans, but each of them is bent and turned in a different way. And when they're installed in a space, they're installed differently every single time. So there's a way in which the curator and the conservator have a big role in the way in which the art appears. On the right, we have Vinculum 2, which is these 2 pieces of wire that get installed in various ways by a curator. Eva Hesse died in 1970. She has a very short period of productivity, but has this really enduring legacy. And her works, they are degrading and they are installed variously. So there's this other life to her work in a way that doesn't really have her approval or her eye on it, which I think is, it's in some ways really problematic, in other ways exciting. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to end with Saul LeWitt, who is a Connecticut-born artist who maybe you're familiar with. He was born in Hartford, and he, I think he was always interested in art. He used to go to the Athenaeum with his mom, and listen to music. He did this children's program where they would listen to music and be instructed to draw while they were listening. So whatever the music made you feel like drawing. And he went to art school. He worked as a graphic designer. And at a certain point in the beginning of his career, he was in New York and he didn't know quite what to do. He was working as a night receptionist at MoMA. Many artists in the 50s and 60s worked at MoMA. And so there was a community of artists who would talk about the works that they were making. He was working there with Bob Mangold, with Lucy Lepard, with Dan Flavin, a number of other of his contemporaries. And he was feeling that pressure, the pressure of the Jackson Pollock legacy that I mentioned before. And he started thinking about the line. He started thinking about very, very basic elements. And he decided in an exhibition in 1968 to make a drawing on a wall for a group exhibition. He called it Line in Four Directions. So he made a square, divided it into quadrants, and then made lines in four directions. And that drawing that he made on a wall was on the wall for the duration of the exhibition, about 3 months. And at the end of the exhibition, he painted over it. It existed as on a piece of paper. It was called a certificate, wall drawing number 1, lines in four directions. And it could be recreated, reinstalled, but it didn't have to be materially realized in order for it to exist, because it existed on the certificate. And that certificate could be bought and sold, borrowed. He continued to make many, many wall drawings over the course of his life, over 1,000. And this is wall drawing 260. And they come with instructions. So you see, on black walls, all two-part combinations of white arcs from corners and sides, and white straight, not straight, and broken lines, 1975. And artists, not LeWitt, people who LeWitt trained, and now that he is no longer with us, people who he train other people, they execute the drawing on the wall. He was very interested in the conceptual basis of art. He wrote a lot about conceptual art. One of the things he wrote was, the idea becomes the machine that makes the art. So you have the idea, you have these instructions, and that then produces the work. I will conclude by saying that Saul LeWitt and Eva Hesse were very good friends, so this artist who we see here. And when he first started working, he made strictly straight lines. He was really into order. And Eva Hesse died very young of a brain tumor in 1970, and he was really good friends with her, and he was totally heartbroken. And in 1970, after this happened, he was installing a show in Paris, and he decided to include a not straight line in his drawing as an ode to, an homage to Eva Hesse. And he continued to use the not straight line. So the not straight line, especially if you're having other people draw it, I mean, who knows what a not straight line is? Like, we would all interpret that differently. And he continued to incorporate this not straight line into his vocabulary, which I think is a wonderful statement on the kind of community and generosity that exists between artists. So I'm going to conclude there, and I am happy to answer any questions. Yeah?
I wondered where you see painting going in the future. I'm a little tired of seeing performance art and installations and overly politicized things. And when I went to the Yale Art Gallery this summer, the thing that grabbed me the most was the Basquiat.
Yeah.
That was so exciting. But, you know, art can't be repetitive or everybody's bored by it. So I wondered what your thoughts were.
You know, that's an interesting statement. Art can't be repetitive because everyone's bored by it. Because I think sometimes, actually, some people would like it to be repetitive in a way. I mean, there's certain things, there's something really lovely about looking at, you know, a realistic depiction of a person or a building or a landscape.
Yes, I mean the art world does.
The art world. I think that's it. It's the artists who don't want to do it. Yeah, it's like kind of we sometimes want them to. I can say if you go through Yale Studios, the open studios, so these are the students who are working now, there's lots of painting going on. And there's painting that is depictive. There is very abstract work, but there's absolutely painting going on and being taught. There's also painting that happens at MoMA. I would say that a lot of recent work is focused on installation and performance. And I think performance is really at this strange moment where it's being incorporated into museums, but it often gets incorporated in a programmatic kind of way, so that there'll be a program where people come in and dance, but it's not necessarily something that's always up, and I think that that's something that will evolve over time. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think that there is still painting happening, and I think if you and there's still a great appreciation of painting. Like the Magritte show is packed all the time. People love to see that work.
Which one?
The Magritte show at MoMA. Yeah.
Could you use the microphone?
Oh, sure. Sorry.
I'm here.
Sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
I'm not sure if this is performance art or not, but could you talk about Tilda Swinton, what that was all about, and what your reaction to it is?
I actually didn't see, so he asked about the Tilda Swinton piece at MoMA. Did you see it?
I did.
Okay. Could you just talk a little, can you just say a few sentences about it? I personally didn't see it.
Yep. So Tilda Swinton, who is a movie star, was in a glass box that looked kind of like a large aquarium, sleeping, really close, and I think she was going to do this 8 or 10 times during the year at days that were not advertised ahead of time. So we happened to be there, and I don't know, I had a lot of different reactions to it. It was disturbing on some level.
Okay, so did people hear his description of what the Tilda Swinton piece was? No? Okay, so Tilda Swinton, who is a movie star, had this piece at MoMA where she was in a box that was had glass on its side, so you could see into it, and she was asleep at MoMA, and you would kind of happen upon it. So it wasn't published that she would be sleeping at a certain time, but you might find her in the galleries. And I would say that that was a fairly controversial work, controversial slash... I think some people just thought, oh, like, why did that happen? But, I think, as I said, I think that MoMA's really experimenting with performance. And one of the things that I love about working at MoMA is that I'm always encouraged to take a risk. I'm always, if I want to try something, I'm told to try it. And they say, if you fail, you will learn something from it. So when we do public programs, now we're doing a new kind of public program where we don't give lectures in front. So for the last many years, typically if you came to MoMA at 11:30 or 1:30, you could join a tour that would be a lecture through the gallery, kind of like what we just did. I would solicit some questions and conversation, but it would mostly be me talking. That has really changed in the last year, where there are these participatory, is that me? Participatory and experimental sessions that happen in the gallery, where you might make a drawing or write something or have a conversation with a bunch of people or engage with an artist writing, and they're very different than what we did previously. For me, it's very fun to always be told, try it. You'll learn something and you'll do something different next time if it doesn't work. So I see the Tilda Swinton piece as part of that. I don't know if you saw the Mariana Abramovich work. She is a performance artist who is probably one of the first. Did you see it? Yeah, the first and a very, very important performance artist. And she had this work where she was in the atrium, that big open space that I had a slide of, and she sat in a chair and people lined up to sit across from her. And she was silent. They just looked at one another, and it was this very, very intense work. And I think MoMA will continue to do things like that. And I would say some of them work and some of them maybe don't as well. There was a work by Yoko Ono in the atrium for a while, where there was a microphone in the atrium, and the work had instructions. It's from when she's part of this kind of loose group called Fluxus, where there are instructions for making art, and the instructions are something like, walk up to the microphone, scream as loud as you can. Children had a heyday. So you would be in the museum looking at art and all of a sudden be absolutely frightened. And I think it probably gave guards a big headache. But it was actually some parts of it, and people would go up, or maybe it was go to the microphone and make I don't know if it was scream. because people went up and did other things that were actually much more pleasing to the ear. So it kind of varies. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are you always looking to expand? I mean, did you see the Edmund DeWall show at the Gagosian last week?
No.
It was the most beautiful exhibit. He's a ceramicist in England, and it was so modern. But his collection isn't in your museum or a lot of museums around here. And it just was so breathtaking.
So the question is MoMA always looking to expand?
What are you hoping to acquire next? What do you?
I do not do any of the acquiring. The curator, Ann Temkin, is always open to suggestions, and I actually have never sent her a suggestion, but she's always, if we notice that something's missing when we're trying to do different education programs, the curatorial departments are completely open to receiving those suggestions. For particular artists, it's worth looking on MoMA's website because in many instances we probably do have the work. There are some holes in the collection or moments that are, or periods of art that are perhaps less well represented than others, but usually there's a fairly active acquisition program. Yeah, so Yale, in comparison, many of the works that come to Yale come by donation, whereas MoMA acquires work more regularly.
Can you also tell us what the works are that Mrs. Bliss said could not be sold? Do you know what they are?
I believe the Cezanne work that I showed you, and there's one other work that, maybe it's another Cezanne, maybe it's a Cezanne drawing. I think there were 2 works. Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Yes?
I was at the museum the other day, and they were showing an exhibition of pillowcases. And people that were looking at it were saying things like, is this art?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say art is?
Did everyone hear that question? Okay, so what would I say art is? I think some of it depends on context. Right now I feel like art can be anything, and I will say an example from that happened in my own life the other day. I was at the museum, and there was an exhibition being installed, and on one of the walls of the installation they had done a paint swatch to see what the color would look like. And as I was walking a group by, someone said, "Whose work is that?" And I thought, that's pretty amazing because, I think it's like 2013 or thereabouts that we would have that reaction, that really anything you see is a work of art. I think that when you're in an art context, that becomes even more just a given. But I think what's a work of art? Something that makes you think, a creative gesture. I don't have a set answer to that question, but I will say that I think that definition has gotten broad to the point of almost maybe sometimes being kind of meaningless, that you end up, having to think about new ways to frame things because the idea of art is so, so broad. Yes?
On that same topic, where does beauty fit in?
So where does beauty fit in? I think that that's such a contested topic. So many people have written so much on beauty and are far more eloquent than I am. I think that beauty, it's kind of how you define it, and it's different for every single person. I think that beauty sometimes gets tied up into connoisseurship. So certain people, it might be thought that certain people have the ability to discern what's beautiful or not. I think it's a lot of things. It goes back to the idea of newness. I think in art, beauty is often the new. It's pleasing to the eye, but that can vary too. There was, there's often exhibitions that people go to that the work is repugnant in a way, and there's something very alluring and attractive to it. I'm really sorry. That Picasso work, I'll keep my hands behind my back. The Picasso work that I showed you, the Demoiselle d'Avignon, that work is, people thought it was horribly ugly when it was first made. The
Sometimes P words will make it do that, and all I do is adjust it, and
Okay.
it stops it, so hopefully that's...
I'll avoid all P words. I won't say that. So I showed you the Van Gogh Starry Night. There's the Night Cafe is at Yale, and Van Gogh wrote it to his brother about that work, that he was trying to express the horrors of humanity through the ugliest colors he could possibly think of. And it's really contrasting colors, and yet we look at it today and we think it's totally gorgeous. So I think that it really varies. Any other questions? Yeah?
There was a rain room
Yes.
recently, and I read where people would stand in line for 4 or 5 hours to go in there. And I was sad to miss it, but can you talk about that?
Sure. So this summer there was a work called The Rain Room, and I'm forgetting the name of the firm who did it, but it was a kind of technology art firm that put it together, and maybe it was Creative Time, but don't quote me on that, I don't remember who did it. So it was in an empty lot that's next to MoMA. It's where there's been a few architectural exhibits, and they basically built a structure, and in that structure you would wait for a very long time in the street until you got inside. And once you were inside, it was completely black, and there was rain coming down. And the rain, there were sensors in the space so that when you stepped somewhere, the rain above you stopped. And there was a light. So if the building was like this and this was south, there was a light coming from the south, these like floodlights, so that the only way that you saw the light was as it was reflected on the rain that was coming down. It was very beautiful. I mean, obviously that's too long to wait. It was very, very hot too most of the days when there were really long lines, and that seemed, well, that was problematic. They had a staff day, and I couldn't go the staff day, so I had kind of given up hope on going because we had to wait just like everybody else. And I ended up, in one instance, getting there very early and being able to go. And it was really pretty magical, just because it was so dark. Not so much the technology of it and the fact that you didn't get wet, because you did get a little wet, but the way that the light hit the rain, and to be in this black space that was lit only by the glimmer of light on rain was really gorgeous.
People were taking pictures of that also. There were some very beautiful pictures.
Yeah, there were some very beautiful pictures. I think because it was so dramatic. Yeah.
I think the firm was called Random International. Is that me?
It may be. I'm not sure. I just don't remember.
I just like
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Someone else had a question. Yeah.
Did I read that the Metropolitan is expanding the area of modern/contemporary art and collaborating with the Whitney?
The Met is moving. So the question is the Met expand, the Metropolitan Museum of Art expanding into modern contemporary? They've always had modern and contemporary, so they have that kind of back section with the very high walls. They are going to move into the Marcel Breuer building on Madison and 74th Street when the Whitney moves to 14th Street. And the Breuer building will display their modern and contemporary works, as I understand it. I don't know all that much about the Met, but I believe that to be true. And I think it is a fixed-term lease, so I don't think that it's a forever situation, and I'm not sure what is going to happen after that. I really love the Whitney space. I think it would be sad if there wasn't work in it. Any other questions? Thank you very much.